Nvidia's decisions leading up to GamesCom 2018 made it abundantly clear that the company were looking to focus on ray tracing with its next generation of GeForce graphics cards. Nvidia was showing off the Volta architecture running ray tracing, and yup, the moment that Jensen Huang took to the stage at GamesCom, it was clear that that was the direction they were going to be going. Jensen Huang was very happy to announce that this was the biggest leap in GPU technology since the inception of the GeForce 8000 series, which was powered by Tensor. This was a marked departure from previous graphics architectures. Gone were separate pixel and vertex shaders. Instead, we welcomed in the era of unified shaders. The idea here was pretty simple. It's very hard to optimize a specific graphics architecture for games of the future, or indeed for games of that era when different studios are using different game engines, and of course game loads can change on a per frame basis. With the unified architecture, that was no longer the case. You had unified shaders which were capable of either achieving pixel shading, geometry tasks, or whatever else was required. So now we had the unified architecture which was capable of running pixel shading, vertex, whatever was required for that specific frame. It also opened the doors to the era of GPU computing. Think of any modern CPU. Let's take the Threadripper 2990WX. It has 32 processor cores, 64 threads. It looks mighty impressive, doesn't it? But think of this. A modern high-end GPU has at least 100 times more shaders inside of it. Yes, those shaders are less complicated and they can't make the complex decisions of a modern CPU, but that's not the point. If you're just trying to crunch away a problem, if you're trying to run a lot of tasks in parallel, it's very hard to beat the sheer performance of a modern-day graphics card.
But with Turing, there's two distinct new components inside the GPU. The first of which are the Tensor cores, and the second of which is ray tracing cores. In a nutshell, the Tensor cores are there to run AI and neural networks designed to process vast amounts of AI calculations. RT cores are there to calculate ray tracing by figuring out where certain rays of light, which are cast into the scene, would intersect with on-screen pixels. Ultimately, these two new components power much of the new talked about features inside Nvidia's new cards, a technology cumulatively known as RTX. But RTX isn't just about ray tracing, but also technology such as DLSS, deep learning supersampling. For months there was conjecture if we'd see RT cores inside of Nvidia's GeForce 20 cards, and an even bigger question if we'd see Tensor cores. Tensor cores were the realms of GPUs such as Volta, cards worth several $1,000s. Nvidia are not looking to replace traditional rasterization techniques anytime soon. Instead, they're looking to augment it with ray tracing and other such technologies. To paraphrase Jensen Huang during his GamesCom presentation, GPUs are just really good at traditional techniques. You can have a lot of stuff going on in parallel and it's really fast. While everything looks 3D to us, because of everything has perspective and depth, in reality the scenes are actually rendered and then converted into 2D images to be displayed on our screens. Not a lot of stuff that goes on, and this video isn't going to happen exactly, but what you need to know is that the GPU draws objects on screen using geometry, figuring out where they're going to be placed on screen, and figures out which objects are going to be clipped by others, and discards anything that's hidden, and then applies various textures and post-processing effects to render the game. Then, finally, after the image is constructed, it's sent to the screen. While targeting a frame rate of 30 FPS, the game needs an average of 33.33 ms per frame to be rendered in. So it has to do this 30 times per second. If you're targeting 60 FPS, the GPU has half the time to accomplish the same task, 16.67 milliseconds, and so on. Higher resolutions also increase the number of pixels which need to be processed. For example, from going from 1080p to 1440p is 2.25 times the number of pixels for the GPU to render. This increases the work on the GPU shaders, the amount of data being held in the RAM, the amount of data being shunted around the card, and so on and so on. So larger numbers of pixels and the more detailed the pixels, i.e. increasing texture resolution and level of detail, therefore impacts frame rates as you're asking the GPU to do more stuff while still trying to maintain a stable and playable frame rate. So then, the more complex the scene, the more taxing it is. So a forest scene is going to eat up more GPU power than, let's say, if you're playing the same game, but with your face pressed against a wall. By the way, we've also got an article tackling how frame rate is important to games and resolution. I'll link it in the video description, or you can find it linked in the article to this article, if that makes any sense. Okay, so great. Now we've told you about the basics of a GPU. Okay, great. Now I've told you the basics of how a GPU used to work in the traditional sense. How does ray tracing, or specifically Nvidia's RTX technology, come into this? Well, remember how I just told you that rastered images are essentially 2D, and the 3D world is projected into this, and things that aren't there are thrown away or not rendered. But in the real world, that's just not how physics and light work. If you can't see an object directly because, let's say, it's behind you, but you're facing a mirror or another reflective surface, you can still see that object in the mirror. In the game world, this is where things get tricky, just like Microsoft's GDC 2018 ray tracing demo, which demonstrated this with a ship and SSR, screen space reflections. You have seen reflections before in games, of course, and modern day reflections are likely using a technique known as SSR. So with the example here, Microsoft used a ship and pointed out the sails would indeed reflect just fine in the water, but anything not in the cone of the camera's view wouldn't, and that's just not right. The flag at the top layer is just totally missing. Ray tracing is the act of trying to calculate how light, and therefore shadows, would appear in the real world, by throwing in thousands of rays of light into a scene and then figuring out where and when a pixel would be intersected by that ray of light. The problem is that this approach, as you'll know if you run certain PC benchmarks, is that it's just a technique which is very expensive in terms of computational time. Sure, if you're rendering a Hollywood movie, or you're even creating a 3D animation in your own home, it doesn't really matter if it takes a minute or two to produce one frame. But to a gamer, yeah. So that's what the ray tracing cores do inside of the Turing architecture. Let's take the TU102 GPU for example. Oh, and this is the full fat core too, not the slightly watered down GPU that's found inside the RTX 2080 Ti. You'll see there are 4608 CUDA cores split across 72 SMs streaming multi-processors, and finally 72 ray tracing cores. We'll get into tensor cores in a few. So that means that each SM contains 64 CUDA cores. Those SMs have their own caches and so on, and we've done an article of that if you want more information, and also an RT core per SM. For those who are not going to be purchasing the full-blown TU102 GPU, in other words, the Quadro 8000, and instead picking up the more reasonably priced RTX 2080 Ti, you'll see a cut down to just 68 SMs and 68 RT cores. According to the official specs from Nvidia, the RT cores of the TU102 is capable of throwing up 10 giga-rays per second. And if you notice the on-screen presentation of Jensen Huang, we see a lot of info regarding the GPU. Keeping our focus on the RT cores though, and there's RTI, Ray Triangle Intersection, and BVH, Bounding Volume Hierarchy. Started things out with RTI, which is the Moeller-Trombor intersection algorithm. It's a method of calculating the intersection of rays of light and triangles and how they mesh in 3D space. This is combined with Bounding Volume Hierarchy, and you can think of these as boxes within a box, and these form a tree of different boxes. Think of these boxes as a way to contain certain objects within a scene. If you have 3 boxes, for example, and you shoot a ray of light at the scene, but only box 2 says, yup, that's me, you can discard the other boxes. Then likewise, that box will contain further sub-boxes until eventually the area of ray of light intersects and a pixel and RTI can begin. Although details aren't fully released yet of Turing, it's highly likely that this is what the GPU does. It can then use the logic to know where it can add additional rays which follow the same path, and it will know that similar calculations can be performed. According to developers, the RT cores are largely programmable, but with BVH and triangle intersection being fixed function. When RT cores have the results, it can then create the appropriate workload as warps, which are, just think of it, instructions, which can then run on the general purpose CUDA cores of the RTX graphics cards. In a nutshell, the RT cores are pretty much a dedicated pipeline calculating the rays of light in triangle intersections and feeding that information to the rest of the GPU. While this might change, there's a discussion right now regarding the performance of ray tracing in games, such as the Tomb Raider, Battlefield and so on, and how developers are targeting just 60 FPS at 1080p. The fact of the matter is, this technology is still in its infancy, and when talking about real-time graphics, movie render times would be considered impressive for hours at a single frame of animation, so the fact that we're seeing Turing push games at real-time performance levels is impressive. Doubtlessly though, this will be something that improves over time. Nvidia have also added in Tensor cores within the Turing architecture, and one of the more surprising announcements of the show was they remain largely intact in all of the currently announced GeForce RTX 20 SKUs. The 576 Tensor cores of the Quadro RTX 8000 received a slight cut down to just 544 for the RTX 2080 Ti. But still, it's a clear demonstration that Nvidia are planning to do a lot of work with deep learning and neural nets on the cards. This cut has reduced performance of the Quadro RTX 8000 and 6000 from 125 TFLOPs to 150 TOPS in 8 and 500 TOPS in 4 to 110 TFLOPs FP16, 220 TOPS in 8 and finally 440 TOPS in 4 for the RTX 2080 Ti. And one of the first areas we're seeing this is DLSS, Deep Learning Super Sampling, which has been demoed by Nvidia at GamesCom. Nvidia were also showing off notorious benchmarks showing that RTX 2080 will also put out about double the performance of its predecessor, the 1080, when DLSS is being used. Without DLSS, Nvidia are currently claiming we'll see about a 50% improvement in games. So what is DLSS then? Well, Deep Learning Super Sampling leverages the performance of Nvidia's Tensor cores to run a neural network to improve image quality by using lower resolution samples. Nvidia have been doing a lot of this in denoising and upsampling for images for years, so it's no surprise we'll see it usage in gaming.
Deep learning and neural networks are a pretty complex topic, and yes, that's the understatement of the century. So an in-depth analysis of how this functions is not really in the realms of this video, but we can certainly discuss DLSS. What you need to understand when it comes to deep learning and neural networks is that they operate in two distinctive ways. The first is training. This is where you're training a network to perform a specific task. The second is inference. That's where the network has been trained to do that task and it can run on lower end hardware.
Training is for the AI to actually learn how to do a task, and it does so by using large sets of data and then figuring out how something should be, what it should look like, or what pattern it's looking for, so on. So let's say you're showing it 10,000 photos of a cat, the AI will start getting really good at saying, okay, well, this is the characteristic of a cat. And will start to recognise the different breeds, shapes, sizes and colours, and of course, if it gets it wrong, you just give it a no, that's a bad AI, and it continues to learn and so on and so on. But eventually, you show it a cat sitting next to a dog or a cat sitting on a sofa, and the neural network will no longer mistake your recliner seat for a cat. Spot, and you're good. The training ideally requires an awful lot of power. An awful lot. High-performance supercomputers crunch through the data way faster, of course, and of course you're also dealing with huge amounts of data. Lots of RAM required, lots of processing power. But you've trained a network, and therefore that can be leveraged to run on smaller devices by means of inference. That is really what DLSS is doing, using your home Turing card Tensor cores to run the patterns that have been trained using the big supercomputers at Nvidia. Unfortunately, some of the finer details of how DLSS works has not been confirmed yet, but it appears that the GPU renders a frame of animation at a lower resolution, for example 1080p, then the Tensor cores will run a neural network which upsamples that into a higher resolution image. We can assume that this is not done post-process, so the CUDA cores / other parts of the GPU render the frame of animation, then the CUDA cores get hold of it. We likely assume these events are being done largely in parallel. This means that Nvidia will need to train specifically the neural network for each game. There's a lot of questions as to the performance of this and how it will be impacted with the use of Tensor cores. Nvidia have also confirmed that it will offer these services to developers for free as well. When upsampling an image, so let's say you want to blow an image up from native 1080p to a much higher resolution, you start introducing noise into the photo. If doing so with traditional techniques, this is because you're not really adding additional details, you're simply increasing the pixel count, blowing up what's already there. So noise in the original image and any imperfections get magnified, plus of course other issues are introduced. Nvidia's technology though can identify problems created with the noise and realise it shouldn't be there because it's training on a noiseless and noisy data set. We can assume therefore Nvidia likely trained AI in the drives at high resolutions, let's say 4K or greater, and then tested it with lower resolutions internally, let's say 1080p. So now the AI is getting really good at understanding the subtle nuances of a certain game's artistic stylings and how character models are supposed to appear. According to Nvidia, it will once again offer these services free to developers and can be downloaded just with a few megabytes of data on the drivers. According to what we've seen of the Unreal 4 Infiltrator demo, which was actually first came to light back in 2013, just when the new generation of consoles was released. Ironically enough, there was actually a big deal made of this at the time because it was actually missing the advanced SVOGI advanced lighting techniques which Epic had been telling us about shortly before. This was because the PS4 and the Xbox One just were not capable of running it, and therefore Epic removed it from Unreal Engine 4. But performance essentially doubles, from an average of around 35 FPS on a 1080 Ti to around 70 FPS of an RTX 2080 Ti. Impressive indeed, but of course it feeds into Nvidia's claims of double the performance of Pascal, if DLSS is being used. You might also be tempted to look at the die shots Nvidia was showing during GamesCom, as they attempted to illustrate how data was being passed around the GPU, and you would be forgiven in thinking, well, this part has the RT cores, Tensor cores go here, and so on. But that's just not true. Let's take Volta for example, where each SM has the following: 64 FP32 cores, 64 Int32 cores, 32 FP64 cores, 8 Tensor cores, and 4 texture units. It hasn't been fully confirmed with these details and that they were the same as Volta, but since the slides of the press deck have leaked early, we now have confirmation the number of Tensor cores is 544. So if we do the maths then of 544 divided by 68, the number of SMs we know to comprise of the RTX 2080 Ti's, 4352 CUDA cores, we can therefore know that the Turing layout is pretty darn similar to that of Volta, including confirmation from Nvidia themselves that just like Volta, Turing has separate FP32 and integer cores. So rather than thinking of Tensor cores, RT cores, and CUDA cores as separate bits on the GPU, instead understand that each SM contains these components. It would appear, therefore, given the information, we can make the following deductions of the RTX 2080 Ti, and this is per each of the 68 SMs. There are 64 FP32 cores, 64 Int32 cores, and in addition to that, there's 8 Tensor cores, 1 RT core, and 4 texture units. We'll do a deeper dive of the architecture of the SMs and other components of Turing soon, but from what we can understand, given these leaks and available info, Turing is a tweaked and improved version of Volta. Concessions have certainly been made in cache systems, particularly level 1 cache and shared data cache size, but we still get the major cache system improvements of Volta. We'll see the larger memory bandwidth compared to Pascal, the separation of FP and Int cores at SMs, and so on.
Well, hopefully you have enjoyed part 1 of our delve into the Turing graphics architecture. Of course, we'll be going much more in-depth when the cards are finally released, and we'll be doing benchmarks and going into exactly how things stack up against Pascal along with the other GPUs. But for now, that's a fundamental understanding of DLSS, along with ray tracing on the Turing architecture, and of course a small peek at the difference in the CUDA cores and the overall architecture of the GPU. With that said, part 2 will of course be coming up soon. I'd also like to thank everyone for all of the likes, the shares, the comments, and just the interactivity that we've been receiving on the channel and the positive support. It's been absolutely mind-boggling, and I thank you all very, very much. Of course, I'm going to also take this opportunity to briefly plug our Patreon. That's not to say that we expect you to donate or anything like that, but if you choose to do so, of course, we would be very appreciative. You can find a link in the video description. So if you do decide to give us just $1 a month, then of course that would go towards improving the quality of content. It would go to buying new hardware and new cameras and all of that stuff. But if you can't afford to do that, or you don't wish to do that, by all means, do not feel you have to. That's totally down to you. Just simply watching our content, subscribing, sharing our content on social media or Reddit or what have you is still greatly appreciated. And I truly thank you all for the support. With all of that said, thanks very much for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.